good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can an evil tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth forth not good fruit shall be cut down and cast into the fire. Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. The admonition of our Lord today is a most solemn one, as it concerns the foundation of all meritorious prayer and good works in the sight of God. If one be in the state of grace, even the smallest good that we do, even if we're not thinking about it, is beneficial, not just naturally, but supernaturally, as long as we have what's called an habitual, virtual habitual attention. Actually, it's, yeah. So, and even if we're not specifically willing in the moment to do good for God, as long as we have a disposition and we haven't taken it back, the intention to do all for God's glory, it will benefit us not just now, but in the hereafter. Okay. On the other hand, if one be not in the state of grace, even the most heroic act merits absolutely nothing for heaven. This is excluding, obviously, an act of martyrdom. Because if we actually are martyrs, then it presupposes, in a way, that we have made, there's a perfect act of contrition involved with that to make that heroic act, in which case the sacrament would not be necessary. But accepting that, even, like, no matter what else we do, we can do the greatest thing. If we're not in the state of grace, God is not going to be pleased. Okay. The most one can hope for in such a case would be obtaining the grace to make a good confession and returning to the supernatural life. Okay. Now, point of clarification, I basically kind of made it already, jumped the gun a bit, but on one hand, it is the teaching of the church, basically at least the theologians before the Second Vatican Council, that the habitual virtual intention is what's necessary to advance God's grace. You don't have to actually be willing it. There were theologians who said, unless you actually will the act for God, that it would not be meritorious for heaven. And it would seem that even though some of the writers that accept the more, it looks like a more liberal teaching is actually correct. That even when we're not specifically willing an act for God, that just by the very fact that we're trying to stay in the state of grace and everything we're doing, it's meant for God. Okay, so that was the teaching of Father Henry Davis, who was an English theologian, obviously Catholic, maybe 1930s and 40s, who was taught in the seminaries before Vatican II. Okay. But he did say also, of course, it is much better to explicitly will as many good acts for God's glory as is possible during the day, for these are more meritorious. There's a better fruit than if it's simply implicitly willing the glory of God. Okay. Now, maybe an example of this would be, in the beginning of the day, you make the general intention. All the prayers I will say today, all the good works, every indulgence attached to them, you're saying that you want them to count, basically. In a way that is a direct intention, not simply implicit, but then maybe during the day also, it could be like when you come before the Blessed Sacrament and you pray your rosary. You want to also renew that intention and say, I'm offering this rosary for the plenary indulgence, either for myself, for the Holy Souls, or for Our Lady, for her intentions. Okay. The third is the best, actually. So we'll see a little bit more about Our Lady in a moment as regards good fruit. Okay. Concerning those not in the state of grace, while it is true that we gain nothing for heaven while in such a condition, it is also important to remember that the good that we do could not be done without God's help. That God is the author of all good and not just supernatural good. Okay? So, but for the grace of God, nothing. St. Augustine states that even in heaven, when God rewards the just, he is simply crowning his own works, his own merits. Okay. For those separated from God, if he allows them to do good, it is because he wants to pardon them and have a reason to restore them to his friendship. If he did not care to do so, he would simply take them out of this life. That would be it for the first mortal sin. His thought should encourage those steeped in sin or struggling with attachment to sin to prepare for confession by works especially opposed to a particular vice. At the same time, we do not know how many sins, mortal sins, that God will allow. We've probably talked about this before. St. Alphonsus the Glorious, his belief, his teaching, that God sets a certain number of mortal sins for each individual. It could be one, and then you're done. Like that 5-year-old that blasphemed, and then he died in the town, 5 years old. Another could literally commit 1,000 mortal sins, and God, for whatever reason, decides to pardon them. They might be in purgatory for the rest of, as long as we know, until the end of time. But at the same time, he does pardon them for his purpose. Because at the end of time, he's going to show his justice and he's going to show his mercy. And we don't know which side of that we're going to be on. So all we need to know is that if we've been guilty of one mortal sin or however many mortal sins, don't commit any more. If you don't commit another, and you've made a good confession, you're okay and you will stay okay. Whether the fruit is the most beautiful or just barely okay, you'll get there, right? But so we don't know. God only promises us this moment, this day. We don't know if we have tomorrow. We don't know if we commit this sin that we're tempted to, that we will be able to go to confession. We don't know. And God has taken many souls, maybe not the majority, but many souls that were in the habit, or in the act, I should say, of committing even that one mortal sin, and that was it. And if God is patient with us, St. Alphonsus the Glorious says, be careful, because if he allows you to commit many sins and you don't make it, your hell is going to be that much worse than that one little boy that did that one blasphemy. Okay. For struggling with sin, we have a positive thought to spur us on, along with the negative thought to keep us from going or getting worse in the meantime. Okay. Also, if we are consecrated to Our Lady and we are in the state of grace, then the fruit produced via our cooperation with God's grace is made better, not in essence, but in the matter of presentation to Him. Some of you may have read this before in St. Louis Montpert's theology, in True Devotion. This is a part of the preparation for the consecration. It's actually, when I was reading the theology of Our Lady, 1996, it was the first thing I read about her, actually. And something that's always stuck with me. Of course, it'd be good to remember it more often, but speaking about more than habitual, virtual intention, right? He states that when we do good, there is most often some admixture of self-interest involved with it. So rather than allowing what we do to be presented to His Divine Majesty as it is, if we're consecrated slaves of Jesus and Mary, Our Lady washes the fruit, puts it on a golden dish, so to speak, and then gives it to God. 3 things, I think you already see it, make this manner of presentation superior to us doing it on our own. First, it is clean of defects. If it has some dirt on it, it's just fallen from the tree. Our Lady is washing it, making it very clean, very beautiful. Okay? It's like that minor absolution we said about last week, that when the priest gives the communion, that you're being cleansed of venial sins. Okay, if you're not already, because you're being made ready to receive God as perfectly as possible. So in this case, the fruit itself, the good work or the prayer that you've said, maybe you had some distractions, or maybe it wasn't as perfectly charitable as it could have been, but Our Lady has taken care of that. So it is also, second, more dignified, but not simply being given as it is, but in a matter fitting the King of Kings on a silver platter, or in this case, gold plate, right? However you want to look at it. And third, it is presented not by us, but by God's Mother, and is therefore guaranteed to be not just accepted, but cherished by the Lord. And we don't often think about this, okay? But we don't remember just how much we have to be thankful for to Our Lady. Even when we're not thinking about it, we're still trying to love her, but we don't realize every single act we do, how much she is doing for us, and how much better she is making it. Now, of course, as we said before, as is the case in general, even though this is happening simply by an habitual virtual intention, If we make more perfect, specific acts, of course, again, the fruit is bigger and better, right? More luscious, and we're giving Our Lady more to work with. Okay. So, if you have not made the consecration, please do so. We have a few feasts of Our Lady coming up, right? So next month, especially a big one, the Assumption, although now we're a little bit past the time to start, but you still could. It doesn't have to be the 33 days. You could make it 25 to 30 if you wanted to. It's not, though that preparation is not strictly speaking required, but more fruit if you do. Right? So if you've not done it, do it. If you've done it, renew it at least once a year, if not twice a year. You can renew it every month, really. You can technically renew it every day. But that would be more just implicitly than actually going through the whole renewal. Okay. Good. So, also, having just celebrated the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, we're reminded of the help that we've been offered from heaven, both for staying in the state of grace and making better and more frequent acts of the will that will produce good fruit. And also a reminder of the use that God makes of sacramentals, in this case the brown scapular, to assist us, and that to benefit we must humble ourselves. And we must believe in what is folly to the world. God making use of a piece of cloth, what is that about, right? That you hear the devil saying that, scoffing, right? You see the consecration of Russia, and how many have said, oh, act of consecration, what's that? How can that make everything all better? Isn't that too simple? How could one piece of fruit on a tree lead to original sin? Right? God takes that which is insignificant to test us. Test whether or not we will be obedient to Him. So let us be obedient and remind ourselves, especially when we're tempted to sins against the sixth and ninth commandment, to remember we have the brown scapular, we've been enrolled. If we can, kiss it, make the sign, or at least make the sign of the cross with it over the heart. And in that way, you make a specific act, make use of that which has already been given, which you may otherwise forget about. In that moment, you remember, and you bear fruit, and you avoid mortal sin. Okay. Also, and just maybe one more main thread here I want to address briefly is that God's way so often is to use things as significant for holy purposes. We said that. He always acts in a way that is most perfect, which of itself basically all but proves evolution false, because what's more perfect? A gazillion years of little by little this primordial ooze becoming a few cells, becoming you have a nucleus now all of a sudden, and all of a sudden you have these bigger and bigger creatures, better creatures, and one day you get man, right? God said, okay, at some point, you look enough like a man and not like an ape, so I'm going to put a living soul in you, right? So it's ridiculous, right? To anybody who has even modicum of sense of faith. But okay, the other thing was that I don't know if I already said this, but it also makes a long period of creation necessary. This is kind of what I want to get to here as a maybe final point before concluding. Even traditional priests now say otherwise than what I just said. 6 days creation. There are leaders in the SSPX who tell us that to believe such is to make God out to be a fairy, literally. This is something I read when I was on my way across country last year on my sabbatical, and I stopped in Denver, and one of the good friends there showed me a book, and I looked it up online, and it had a how do you say, not just a preface to it, but a accommodation or accolade, I should say, of one of the former district superiors in the SSPX. And this is what he says, and there's one ellipsis here, but it's the main point. Okay. The book itself is called The Realist Guide to Religion and Science by Father Paul Robinson. Okay. And I haven't read it yet, I'm going to read it, and I will go with an open mind to see, just in case there's something I missed, but chances are, if this is any indication, it's not good. Okay. Now, he says this. There is nothing, this is not Father Paul Robinson, this is the other priest. And you can find this online. Okay. There is nothing against faith to consider that the 6 days of creation are 6 periods of time, put in parallel with the week for many spiritual reasons. ... Okay, so far, actually, nothing heretical. right? Because you can believe that and still be in the church. And that is much better than the notion of God as a fairy with a wand, making all things on the spot as we see it today. This is imagination, not theology. I wanted to jump through the phone when I saw this, okay? Because what kind of hubris is that? What kind of pride for anyone to say, basically, God can't, he wouldn't do that. Like, that's not theology. That is God incapable of doing such? And even Father Robinson admitted in another, like he was answering a critique of his book, and he said that he admitted that church fathers of different schools believed differently about how long each day of creation was. But if you believe, like a number of the fathers, that it all happened as it reads and not over vast periods of time, then we're stupid ignoramuses, right? Including those fathers of the church. And as a sorry father, right? But while you're free to believe as you do, it is not childish idiocy to believe that God could do it all at once over 6 literal days. Everything still be perfectly ordered. There are 3 opinions. One was right away, one was over 6 days, and the other is over long periods of time. Okay. St. Augustine's argument that the sun was not created until the 4th day, so 24-hour days is incorrect, is not a definitive one. It's perfectly possible the sun simply took over at that point for what God did on his own the first 3 days. Don't have to believe that, but why is that not possible? Why is that not reasonable, right? Okay. If anything, accomplishing creation more quickly only highlights God's infinite power and incredible design, and should therefore be preferred among a few admittedly legitimate opinions. Furthermore, to exclude the possibility of a literal 6-day creation is, I believe, an insult not just to those who hold that position, but also to Almighty God, who is perfectly capable of doing exactly what is literally described without the help of fairy dust. Okay. So I know this is not maybe directly related to what we were talking about earlier, but still in a way, it is, because it's this kind of smugness that leads to a loss of grace, that limits the good fruit that we can bear if this is the type of way that we think. If we are not being humble, humility is the foundation of virtue. So this kind of name-calling actually is what we've been dealing with in society, right, for the last however many months. We're seeing this type of superficial ad hominem attack more and more on both ecclesiastical and political levels. As one Catholic blog writer put it, we are expected to shut up and don't ask any questions, right? If one disagrees, shame them into silent submission. It is one thing to see this in politics, and it's quite another to see it from those who are called to educate both future priests and the laity, and we should not put up with it. Okay. So bring things back then into focus, without making any specific personal judgments on the priest in question, among others, right? The more that we do all for the glory of God as explicitly as possible, and not just implicitly, the better the fruit that we will bear, and the less likely that we will fall into pride and into making rash judgments on others who may hold a different opinion than we do. Okay. We will take the necessary stand for tradition, while respecting the opinions of those whom respectfully disagree with their non-dogmatic beliefs, and then we will be able to talk about the things that are truly important, while helping others to avoid or to get out of mortal sin, that they too may begin again to bear good fruit that will last for all eternity, and not be thrown into the fire on the last day. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.